A quiet desert town, a forgotten gas station, and a black woman who just wanted to help her cousin run the family business. But when a violent gang targets her thinking she's an easy mark, they have no idea who they're dealing with. Because she's not just a woman behind the counter, she's a trained MMA fighter, a former army instructor, and the last person you want to corner. What follows isn't just self-defense, it's a storm of reckoning, a clash of fear and discipline, and a lesson written in bruises and broken pride. This is a story about resilience, about dignity under pressure, and about what happens when the quiet one fights back. So get comfortable because you won't believe how it ends. And hey, let us know what time you're watching and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below, we'd love to hear from you. There's something about the kind of silence that lives on the edge of a desert town, thick, patient, not quite empty, but waiting. Sabrina felt it the moment her boots hit the gravel lot of Red Mesa, gas and tire, that lingering weight in the air, the kind that doesn't press down but wraps around you like memory. The wind had already picked up when she stepped out of her truck, carrying the dry scent of sagebrush and engine oil fluttering the frayed corners of an old sun-faded sign that read, "Cold drinks, tires, smokes, ice." No punctuation, no urgency. Just like the town itself, flat, dry, slow. She stood there for a moment, hands on her hips, squinting into the sun as it climbed above the distant ridgeline. The sky stretched so wide it felt more like a ceiling than a canvas, and she could hear the faint whine of a power transformer humming near the back of the lot, steady and forgotten, like background noise in a life she hadn't planned on, returning to. The station hadn't changed much. Still 2 pumps, still a cracked soda machine out front, still that one security light over the door that flickered, like it was trying to decide whether to live or die. Inside it smelled like old coffee and newer dust, with a touch of motor oil baked into the floor tiles. She stepped through the door, her shadow trailing behind her, and for a brief second, she could almost pretend she was 17 again, helping her cousin Luis stock shelves during summers when the world still felt soft around the edges. But this time she was here because Luis had slipped on a ladder and fractured 2 ribs, and there was no one else left to run the place while he recovered. So when he called, voice thin and raspy from a hospital bed 2 towns over, she didn't hesitate. She just packed her bag, left Charleston behind, and drove 9 hours through dry night and quiet thought. The register still beeped the same way when she booted it up, and the cooler hummed like an old memory trying to stay relevant. She moved through the aisles with quiet familiarity, adjusting a stack of plastic-wrapped donuts, wiping a fingerprint from the plexiglass case. Her body moved like it remembered this place before her mind caught up like muscle memory she hadn't exercised in years. And yet, despite the routine, her senses remained dialed in, tuned to every small sound, the creak of shelving, the distant rattle of a loose vent, the shift of sunlight through dirty windows. Sabrina had been a fighter for most of her life, first in the army where she taught hand-to-hand tactics in places too dry to name, and later in a handful of regional MMA cages where the lights were harsh and the cheers came fast, but left faster. But here in this store that smelled like her childhood and obligation mixed together, she didn't need to fight. Not physically, just stay sharp, stay still, stay ready. She leaned on the counter and watched the front monitor cycle through its 4 fuzzy camera feeds, the pumps, the alley, the back lot, and the front door. The resolution wasn't great, but it was enough. Enough to catch movement, to sense rhythm, to anticipate the wrong kind of stillness before it arrived. She sipped a paper cup of coffee brewed too long ago, her expression unreadable, posture relaxed but not lazy. Her right hand stayed close to the counter near the switch for the silent alarm, not because she expected to use it, but because she understood that the difference between calm and careless could be measured in inches. No one in Red Mesa asked why she was back. They just nodded when she walked into the hardware store for batteries or looked away when they caught her eyes in the diner. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't welcome either. Just something in between, a quiet question no one had the nerve to speak aloud. Why would a woman like her come back here alone? She didn't answer that question, not even to herself, because it wasn't really about helping Luis or even about unfinished business. It was something deeper, something she hadn't fully named yet. Maybe responsibility, maybe stubbornness, maybe just the way a soldier's mind works when the world doesn't feel quite right. Red Mesa hadn't called her back, but it also hadn't changed enough to push her away. And sometimes that was enough of a reason to stay. As the day wore on, the store stayed quiet, visited only by dust and a couple of ranchers picking up chew and diesel. One of them asked if she was Luis's cousin from the city, and she said, "Something like that." He nodded, muttered something about the heat, and left without asking more. People here liked things simple. As long as the gas flowed and the coffee was hot, they didn't need explanations. The sun dropped lower, casting the long orange streaks of late afternoon across the lot, and she stood at the window, arms folded, watching the road like it might offer some clue about what was coming. But the asphalt gave her nothing, just the occasional shimmer of heat, and the knowledge that isolation and visibility sometimes come packaged together like a trap pretending to be peace. And in that quiet, as the wind kicked up little eddies of dust around her boots, Sabrina let herself settle, not into comfort, but into presence. Because even though the store was still and the town was sleeping with one eye open, she could feel it, the pause before the first tremor, the hush before the glass cracks. And she knew in the marrow of her bones that whatever had brought her back here wasn't done with her yet. The first night came down slowly, like a curtain being pulled across a wide, tired stage that no one had swept in years. The desert air cooled by only a few degrees, but the silence deepened, stretching across the empty highway and settling into the corners of the gas station like dust that had never been disturbed. Inside, the hum of the freezers grew louder without conversation to compete with, and the flickering light above the back door kept rhythm with the ticking of the old wall clock, two sounds that had nothing to say to each other, but still coexisted like uneasy neighbors. Sabrina moved through the aisles with the calm of someone who didn't need to fill silence to feel in control. Her steps, soft shoulders, loose hands occasionally, brushing a crooked candy bar or an out-of-place bag of chips back into line. There was no music playing, no television droning in the background, only the sound of her breath and the occasional gust of wind pushing against the glass door like a stranger testing the lock. She took her time walking from one end of the store to the other, not out of boredom, but to remind herself of every angle, every blind spot, every inch of space she could use if things ever went sideways. Not that she expected trouble, at least not yet, but that wasn't the point. Preparation wasn't about expecting, it was about accepting. She made a mental map of the building, without thinking about it too hard, where the mop bucket was, how quickly she could get from the cooler to the register, which shelf she could knock over to block someone's path if she had to. She didn't look paranoid, she looked practiced. It was in the way her eyes moved slow and steady, scanning not just for movement, but for intention. She had learned long ago that danger didn't always announce itself with sound. Sometimes it walked in quietly, smiled like a neighbor, and waited. At 8:12 p.m. a young couple walked in. College-aged, maybe early 20s, passing through with backpacks and nervous laughter. They bought water, trail, mix and gas for a car that looked like it had seen better days. The boy held eye contact too long, maybe out of habit, maybe out of surprise. The girl barely looked up, and Sabrina rang them up without speaking more than she needed to. They left a crumpled $5 bill on the counter and said thank you, like it might diffuse something they didn't understand. Then they were gone. By 10:00, the road was still again, painted in soft amber by the flickering overhead light that buzzed just enough to let you know it was alive. Sabrina locked the front door from the inside, flipped the closed sign without ceremony, and dimmed the interior lights to the setting Luis always used when he worked the overnight low enough to feel safe, bright enough to see trouble coming. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the machine that never quite got the temperature right, sat down behind the counter, and let her mind wander not far, just enough to drift through the quiet places she usually avoided during the day. Thoughts came slowly like desert birds, cautious and circling. She thought about the cage, fights, the noise, the sweat, the taste of adrenaline. About the army base where she first learned to move faster than her fear. About Luis as a teenager, laughing as he tried to talk her out of enlisting, telling her, "You fight too clean to survive that world." She smiled at the memory, then looked up at the monitor. 4 camera feeds, looped in grainy black and white. Nothing moved on the screen. No cars, no people, just dustlight and shadow. But Sabrina didn't relax. Stillness didn't mean safety. Not here, not anymore. Her body stayed alert beneath the surface. Her breathing measured her fingers, tracing the lip of her paper cup with quiet precision. At 11:46, a dog barked somewhere in the distance. Short, sharp, then gone. She stood and walked to the front window, eyes scanning the parking lot, the edges of the road, the tree line that bordered the back of the property. Nothing. Just open night and the kind of silence that felt earned. She stood there for a while, her reflection faint in the glass, her shoulders drawn back just slightly like someone ready for a conversation that hadn't started yet. Then she turned away, checked the locks again, not because she forgot, but because double-checking had become her version of prayer. The night didn't give her answers. It rarely did. But it gave her space. And in that space, Sabrina moved like someone who had already survived the thing she hadn't yet faced. Because that's what fighters do. They prepare long before the bell rings, and they listen to the quiet not to escape it but to understand what it hides. It started with a sound that didn't belong, low, distant, barely louder than the hum of the coolers, but sharp enough to prick the edge of Sabrina's focus like a needle against skin. She sat still behind the counter, not moving her head, just shifting her gaze toward the monitor above the register where a grainy black and white feed showed the front lot bathed in flickering halogen. A pair of headlights had just clicked off, not slowly like a local pulling in to grab a soda, but quick, intentional clean. The engine idled for a second, then died. No doors opened. No movement followed. Just silence, thick and deliberate like a held breath waiting to become something worse. Sabrina leaned forward, resting her elbows lightly on the counter, fingers steepled in front of her mouth, eyes narrowing as she watched the truck sit still on the edge of the screen. It was a black F-250 matte finish aftermarket grille, the kind of vehicle that didn't flinch when asked to climb over something or someone. Her right hand dropped gently below the counter, not to grab anything, just to find the cool metal of the silent alarm trigger. She didn't press it. Not yet. She needed more than headlights to start a fight, but something inside her shifted the same quiet tick in her chest that used to go off seconds before a flashbang, before a fist, before a mistake. One door opened soft and controlled, followed by the faint creak of a heavy boot hitting gravel. The man who stepped out looked like a composite of every file photo she'd studied in threat assessments. Broad shoulders, shaved head, the kind of casual walk that suggested either supreme confidence or absolute stupidity. His hands were visible open at his sides, not holding anything, not clenched, just there. He walked up to the glass door slowly, the porch light throwing his shadow against the dirty floor tiles like a warning scribbled in motion. Sabrina didn't move from her seat. She watched him step closer, lean in, cup his hands to the glass, and look inside with that particular kind of smile men sometimes reserve for women they believe aren't allowed to say no. After a moment he stepped back, then turned his head slightly, muttering something over his shoulder. That's when the other doors opened, 3 of them in sequence, soft thuds and muffled boots spreading out like a plan already rehearsed. She stood up. Not rushed, not theatrical. Just rose from the stool, straightened her back, and exhaled through her nose. The store felt smaller, all of a sudden the air thicker. She walked calmly to the door, paused with her hand on the lock, and flipped it. The click was louder than usual. The first man pushed the door open without hesitation, brushing past her as if the entryway belonged to him. He didn't speak, neither did she. The others followed, one heading to the far aisle, another to the drinks cooler, the third hanging near the front, arms folded, scanning the space with the bored precision of someone who wasn't looking for something to buy, but for something to break. Sabrina returned to her spot behind the counter. She didn't ask if they needed help. She didn't remind them they were too late to be welcome. She just watched. Watched how the first man picked up a candy bar, unwrapped it, and ate it without paying. Watched how the one near the fridge opened a can of beer and left the cooler door hanging open. Watched how the third one, taller, leaner, with tattoos crawling up his neck, began slowly pulling items off the shelves and dropping them to the floor, not violently, just carelessly, like his fingers had no muscle for anything other than disrespect. Finally, the first one spoke. "You here by yourself?" he asked, voice coated in amusement, as if the answer had already been decided. Sabrina tilted her head slightly, her eyes locked onto his. "You see anyone else?" Her tone was flat, quiet, not defiant, just real. He smirked. "Guess that makes us your guest tonight." From the corner of her eye, she saw the one by the drinks walking toward the back door, maybe to check if it was locked, maybe to open it for more company. She didn't follow him. She didn't raise her voice. She simply placed both hands on the counter, her fingers, splayed knuckles, relaxed. The tension in the room shifted by an inch, just one, enough for the man in front of her to notice, enough for the tall one to stop scattering cans and straighten his spine. The first man stepped forward, leaned his elbows on the counter, eyes narrowing. "You act real calm for someone about to have a bad night." Sabrina met his chaza. "I've had worse." He grinned wide and slow, like he'd just heard the first note of his favorite song. Then he reached forward and grabbed the collar of her hoodie, tugging her slightly across the counter, like he was inviting her into a joke she'd forgotten to laugh at. But her body didn't stumble. It flowed. Because in that instant, faster than instinct, deeper than thought, everything changed. And the night once still and uncertain became something entirely different. Something with edges, something with teeth, something waiting to bite back. The man's hand on her collar wasn't just a mistake, it was a declaration. A line crossed a trigger pulled without warning. Sabrina didn't react with surprise, didn't gasp, didn't freeze. She moved with a kind of clarity that came from repetition, from sweat, drenched training mats and nights in combat zones, where hesitation got you hurt or worse. Her right arm snapped upward between his elbows, breaking the grip at the wrist, not with brute force but precision, a clean, sharp motion that sent him stumbling back 2 steps, his breath catching like he'd just been shoved by something invisible. She didn't give him time to regroup. Her left leg planted, her hips rotated, and her elbow drove forward in a perfect arc, crashing into the center of his chest with a dull, meaty thud that echoed against the glass coolers. He staggered backward, arms flailing, crashing into a shelf of beef jerky and sending it cascading to the floor like fallen leaves in a sudden storm. The sound was ugly, raw, and final, like something important had just been broken. The room shifted. The one by the drinks dropped his can and surged forward, shouting something harsh, a guttural sound that never quite formed words. He swung wide, too wide, and she saw the space before it opened. She ducked under the clumsy punch and drove her shoulder into his midsection, lifting him just enough to rob him of balance. His feet left the ground for a split second before they came down hard against the tile, and by the time he understood what had happened, her knee was already driving into his ribs. He groaned, then wheezed, then went still. 2 down. The tall one near the back took a second longer to react. Maybe he was smarter. Maybe he was scared. He reached behind his jacket, fumbling with something Sabrina couldn't see, and that was the only warning she needed. She crossed the floor in 3 strides, low and fast, grabbing his wrist before it cleared his pocket. He tried to jerk away, but she twisted hard, forced him into the wire rack behind him, and slammed him against it with enough force to send snack bags flying. "Don't," she said, low and sharp, her face inches from his. He blinked, confused by the sudden loss of power, and in that space of hesitation, she drove his hand into the wall hard enough that the object in his fingers, a folding knife, clattered to the floor. She kicked it out of reach. Now there was only one left, the smallest, the youngest, standing near the door with wide eyes and hands that weren't clenched, just hanging loose at his sides. He looked like someone who had agreed to a plan without understanding the cost, and now that the bill was due, he didn't know where to run. Sabrina didn't move toward him. She just stood where she was, surrounded by overturned shelves and unconscious bodies, her breath steady, her hands loose, her presence unmistakable. The boy looked at her, then at the door, then back again. "Go," she said, quiet but firm. He bolted without a word, the bell above the door jingling wildly as he disappeared into the night footsteps, fading fast into gravel and shame. And then for a moment the station fell silent. Not the kind of silence that speaks of peace, but the kind that waits to see what you'll do next. Sabrina exhaled, slow and controlled, rolling her shoulders to check for pain. Her ribs ached, her temple throbbed where a shelf edge had caught her, and her right elbow buzzed with the dull heat of impact. But she was standing, still breathing, still clear. She walked to the back, flipped the switch to lock the doors, then stepped over the bodies like debris after a storm. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel triumph. What she felt was a strange, hollow steadiness, like she had done what needed doing, and nothing more. She reached the counter, grabbed the cordless phone, and pressed a number Luis had written on a yellow sticky note weeks ago. Red Mesa Dispatch, came the voice on the other end. "There's been an incident," Sabrina said, her voice flat but calm. 4 men, maybe 5. They're down. You'll want to send someone. There was a pause. "Are you injured?" She looked at the blood on her knuckles, the sweat on her brow, the chaos around her. "I've been worse," she said. When she hung up, she sat on the floor behind the counter and leaned against the wall, not because she was giving up, but because her body finally gave her permission to rest. The hum of the coolers returned as the dominant sound in the room, the fluorescent light flickering overhead like it was trying to remember how to stay on. And outside, somewhere beyond the pumps, a breeze carried dust across the lot like nothing had happened at all. But something had happened, something loud and quiet and true. And in that stillness, Sabrina let her eyes close, not to sleep, but to breathe just for a moment, just long enough to feel the ground beneath her again. Because she had won the fight, but she hadn't come here to win. She had come here to be left alone, and some men, it seemed, still had to learn what that actually meant. The flashing red and blue lights arrived 15 minutes later, washing across the broken shelves and scattered bodies like a storm trying to clean what it couldn't fully understand. Sabrina stood near the register when they came in, arms folded, feet planted, blood on her knuckles and sweat drying against her neck. But her breath was steady and her eyes were calm, not cold, just focused. The first to enter was Deputy Marla Jennings. Her gray hair pulled tight beneath her patrol cap, eyes sharp behind tired lines, hand near her belt, but not on it because she'd seen enough to know when a weapon wasn't going to fix what had already happened. Jennings didn't speak right away. She walked the floor slowly, taking in the damage, the unconscious men, the dented shelves and overturned racks, the soda still dripping from a crushed can like a clock melting. She looked up at Sabrina and nodded, once a quiet, almost reluctant sign of recognition, not just for what had been done, but for how cleanly it had been handled. No gunshots, no screaming, no innocent bystanders bleeding on the floor. Just consequence delivered like a truth, long overdue. "You all right?" Jennings finally asked, her voice low, less out of concern and more out of protocol. Sabrina didn't move. They came in together, started with words, ended with hands. Jennings glanced at one of the bodies groaning near the snack aisle. "You didn't escalate." "I responded," Sabrina said, her voice even as if she'd rehearsed that sentence in her head for hours. "You'll see it all on the cameras." Jennings didn't argue. She didn't need to. Her eyes scanned the security monitors behind the counter, 4 angles playing in silence, each one telling the same story from a slightly different truth. One showed the man reaching over the counter. Another showed the one with the pipe wrench. Another caught the boy who ran. And all of them stitched together told the same quiet lesson. Sabrina hadn't gone looking for violence, but she had finished what they started. Paramedics came next, 2 of them young and moving quickly, checking pulses and lifting limbs, wrapping gauze around cuts they didn't have time to ask questions about. One asked Sabrina if she needed medical attention. She looked down at her hands, the split skin on her knuckles, the swelling in her ribs, the faint metallic taste still in the back of her throat, and shook her head. "I've had worse," she said, and it was the truth. Outside, a small crowd had begun to form, neighbors drawn by sirens, headlights flickering against windshields, faces half curious, half concerned. Some of them recognized her. A few nodded. Most said nothing. They just stared, unsure of how to frame the story their town was now part of. Later, in the back of Jennings' cruiser, Sabrina gave her statement not because she had to, but because she knew how these things worked. She laid out the timeline with precision when they entered, what they said, how they moved, who struck first, where each blow landed, how long each one lasted. She didn't embellish. She didn't soften it either. Just the facts, clear and cold, like reading coordinates from a map you'd memorized long before the first shot was fired. Jennings didn't interrupt. She took notes by hand, occasionally glancing at the rearview mirror, as if expecting the weight of Sabrina's words to shift the car itself. When it was over, she closed the notebook and rested her pen on the dash. "You know this isn't going to sit quiet," she said. "People are going to talk. Some are already twisting it." "I know," Sabrina replied, leaning her head back against the seat. "Let them. You've got supporters, folks saying you did what had to be done. Others, not so sure." Sabrina didn't flinch. They weren't here. Jennings didn't answer. She just started the car and drove her back to the station. The next morning, the headlines came. Not from newspapers, but from phones, whispers, second-hand versions already filtered through fear or admiration or prejudice. "Woman takes down 4 men in gas station fight. Vigilante MMA fighter defends family business. Is she a hero or a threat?" And beneath the headlines, the comments poured in, some praising, some doubting, some seething, with the kind of venom that only comes from behind anonymous screens. Sabrina ignored them. She swept the floor, restocked the shelves, replaced the broken snack rack, scrubbed the blood from the tiles with water and bleach, until the place smelled sterile again. She didn't play the footage. She didn't replay the fight in her mind. What had happened had happened. The lesson had been given. And whatever the town chose to do with it now, believe it, deny it, fear it, that was no longer her burden to carry. She stood behind the counter that afternoon, sipping coffee, watching a dust devil dance across the far edge of the lot, small and fast and meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Her body still ached in places she didn't bother naming. But she stood anyway. Because some people run from conflict. others survive it. And a few, just a rare few, learn how to hold still in the middle of it without breaking. A young man came in around 4, maybe 19, maybe 20, hair tucked under a baseball cap, eyes nervous but respectful. He bought a soda, dropped exact change, and lingered for a second too long near the counter. "You," the one who he started, then stopped, unsure how to finish the question. Sabrina looked at him without smiling. "I'm the one who was here." He nodded like that was enough, and left without another word. And when the bell above the door fell silent again, Sabrina exhaled slowly, set her cup down, and returned to stillness. Not waiting for trouble, just refusing to pretend it never happened. 3 nights after the fight, the desert wind shifted, not enough to shake the trees or rattle windows, but enough for Sabrina to feel it. It was a subtle change, like the pressure drop before a storm, something in the air that made the skin behind her ears tighten and her breath draw slower, deeper. Red Mesa hadn't forgotten what happened, neither had she. But it was how the silence returned that made her pay closer attention, the way the road stayed quiet a little too long, the way the dusk settled early like it had something to hide. She stood behind the counter, restocking the scratch tickets, and pretending not to notice how the clock's ticking suddenly felt louder than usual. Her ribs still ached, the bruises had shifted from purple to yellow, and the stiffness in her left wrist hadn't completely faded. But her body was functioning steady and responsive, like an instrument that had been through a rough tune-up but still played in key. She sipped black coffee that had gone cold hours ago and scanned the parking lot through the window. Nothing moved, no cars, no headlights, just the long stretch of highway fading into the night like a ribbon of shadow. Then came the sound she'd been waiting for, the low growl of an engine pulling off the road and crunching gravel in a rhythm too deliberate to be casual. She didn't rush to the monitor. She just turned her head slightly, watching as the feed lit up with twin beams from a pair of black trucks that didn't belong to any local customer. The license plates were either covered or coated in dust thick enough to matter. They didn't park near the pumps. They stopped just past the outer edge of the lights where the dark began again. Engines off. Doors closed. No one stepped out. Sabrina took a slow breath and set her cup down. Her fingers didn't shake. Her heartbeat didn't quicken. This wasn't fear, it was clarity. She reached under the counter, flipped the switch that dimmed the store lights to half power, then walked to the back room and quietly unlocked the weapons locker Luis had once used to store old tire irons and busted parts. She didn't grab a gun. She grabbed the carbon baton. Collapsible, balanced, efficient. Back at the counter, she watched the feed again. They were moving now, 6 figures in total, wearing hooded jackets, their pace deliberate but not rushed. 2 circled toward the rear alley. 2 flanked the sides. The other 2 approached the front slowly, one of them carrying something long and metallic that reflected the light just enough to confirm her suspicion. A crowbar, maybe, or a pipe. It didn't matter. This time, they didn't come in with laughter or swagger. They came in formation. They were organized. Sabrina had seen that kind of choreography before, not in street fights or bar scuffles, but in military drills and gang raids. These men had practiced. They weren't reacting out of anger anymore. They were trying to reclaim something they thought had been stolen, and she was the one they blamed. She moved to the back, locked the door, then climbed the short ladder to the roof access hatch. From above, she could see them spread out, one trying the service door, another covering the lot like lookout. She crouched low, using the shadows to shield her silhouette, her breath steady, her grip tight around the baton's handle. The wind carried the faint scent of motor oil and tobacco. No words were exchanged below, only gestures, signals made with fingers, short nods, and shifts in stance. They didn't expect her to come to them. That was their mistake. She descended the ladder, silently crossed the back hallway, and exited through the rear side door just as one of the men reached for the lock. The baton extended with a familiar snap, not loud but unmistakable. He turned too late. Her first strike landed just above the knee, a disabling shot that dropped him instantly. His yell was sharp, panicked, cut short by a second hit to the ribs that left him wheezing on the gravel. The second man heard the noise, spun around, and came at her with the crowbar raised like a baseball bat. She didn't move backward. She stepped forward inside the swing, dropped low, and swept his leg. He fell hard, losing the weapon in the process. She kicked it under the dumpster and grabbed his collar before he could get up, slamming him once into the brick wall hard enough to make the impact echo. He slumped. The silence returned, but only for a breath. One of the flank men appeared from the left, saw what had happened, and froze. He backed away slowly, not out of fear but recalculation. She met his eyes, dark, narrow, measuring. He didn't run. He didn't charge. He simply turned and walked briskly toward the truck, giving a low whistle to the others still circling the front. A signal. Regroup. Retreat. Within 30 seconds, the two at the front turned around and disappeared into the darkness. The engines roared to life, the trucks peeled off without headlights, and the lot went still again. No tires squealing, no shouting, just an exit clean enough to make it feel rehearsed. Sabrina stood alone behind the building chest, rising and falling, arms relaxed at her sides, the baton still extended. Her knuckles ached, her jaw was tight, but she didn't feel adrenaline. She felt awareness. This wasn't a random scare tactic. This was a test. They weren't just trying to intimidate her, they were gathering information, watching how she responded, calculating how far she was willing to go, and most importantly, learning how much she could handle on her own. Back inside, she reset the cameras, marked the time, reviewed the footage, and documented everything. Then she sat behind the counter once again, watching the night swallow the road beyond the pumps, knowing the men in the trucks hadn't lost. Not yet. They had just changed the rule, and now she would change hers. The attack came just before 2 a.m. when the world was supposed to be sleeping, and the desert had cooled enough to make the gravel feel brittle underfoot. Sabrina had been sitting in the back room, legs stretched out, flipping through the service log, while the security monitor ran quietly in the background. The silence hadn't felt peaceful, more like the pause, before something broke, a pressure building behind her eyes, subtle and persistent. She didn't notice the trucks immediately, only the flicker of motion near the edge of the lot, like a shadow darting across the screen before the floodlights could catch it. Then came the second shape, then a third. By the time she leaned forward, the screen was filled with movement, 6 figures, moving low, fast, and without hesitation. She didn't panic. She stood up slowly, body tightening with muscle memory, not fear. Her right hand went to the baton already leaning against the wall, her left to the switch beneath the desk that locked the front door and triggered the silent alert. The camera angles showed them fanning out, 2 at the back entrance, one peeling off toward the dumpster, one climbing onto the storage shed roof, the last 2 walking toward the front glass with the same casual aggression she remembered from combat patrols, the kind that knew it was being watched and didn't care. She inhaled once deep and centered, then moved through the back hallway, not rushed, not loud, just steady, each step part of a plan she hadn't written but knew by heart. The first man reached the back door just as she pulled it open. He didn't have time to register the motion before the baton cracked across his forearm, snapping his grip and sending the pry bar clattering to the ground. He staggered back, yelling, hand twisted, and she stepped into him with a knee to the gut, then a pivot that knocked him into the steel dumpster. His head bounced once, then his knees buckled. The second attacker lunged from the left, swinging a tire iron wide and high. She ducked under the arc, caught him with her shoulder, and drove him against the wall with a low, brutal shove that knocked the wind out of him. He dropped the weapon on impact and clawed at her shoulder, but she twisted her hips, shifted her weight, and slammed her elbow into his jaw before he could recover. He went limp against the wall, eyes fluttering, breath shallow. From above, the man on the roof jumped, landing with a grunt and rolling toward her, expecting surprise. She turned before he could stand, sweeping his leg and catching him mid-rise with a strike to the collarbone. He collapsed, groaning, and didn't get back up. She didn't check if he could. That wasn't the moment. At the front of the store, the glass shook as the last 2 tried to force it, one with a crowbar, the other with a wrench dragging sparks against the frame. Sabrina crossed the store floor in 10 quiet strides, avoiding the shadows, keeping her profile tight. They hadn't seen her yet. She waited until the first one leaned forward, trying to wedge the door open with his shoulder. Then she struck. The door flew open from the inside with a crash, the force knocking the first man off balance. She used that second to jab the baton into his thigh, hard enough to buckle the joint, and then stepped aside as he toppled to the concrete. The last man hesitated, but just barely long enough to make his move awkward. He lifted the wrench too slow, too high. She stepped inside the arc, swept his legs, and sent him flat to the ground. His head hit the edge of the curb with a dull crack. Then came the stillness. For a full 10 seconds, all she could hear was the heaving of her own breath and the soft metallic ping of the fallen wrench. Her heart thudded against her ribs, not out of panic but effort. Her hands were steady, but her legs buzzed with adrenaline. She stood in the doorway, surrounded by bodies she didn't ask for, in a war she never declared. The street beyond the lot was empty again, the stars overhead blinking without sympathy. Her breath slowed, her shoulders dropped. She looked at the men, some groaning, some unconscious, and wondered how far someone had to fall inside themselves before this seemed like a good idea. Inside, the security monitor still rolled grainy and detached, capturing the angles with that cold, impartial eye that never flinched, never asked questions. She watched for another moment, making sure none of them were moving, then walked inside and locked the front door. Her hands didn't shake. She wiped blood from her eyebrow with the back of her wrist and turned toward the counter. The radio crackled on the shelf, Jennings' voice calm but clipped. Unit 4, confirm noise complaint, Red Mesa gas back lot, unknown disturbance. Sabrina picked it up without ceremony. This is Caldwell. I need medical and 2 units at the station. 6 suspects. Situation contained. A pause. Then copy that. Are you hurt? She looked at the bruise blooming beneath her sleeve, the skin on her hands scraped raw, the ache in her shoulder from too many collisions. Nothing new, she said, then hung up. She sat behind the counter, letting the silence fold back in around her like a familiar coat. Her back ached, her ribs throbbed, and a sharp pain shot through her hip every time she shifted. But she sat still, watching the parking lot return to what it always was, flat, wide, unremarkable. It looked the same as before, but now the air felt different. Not just quiet, not just still, something else, like the desert itself, had stopped to listen. She leaned back, eyes half closed, and let the hum of the coolers lull her into stillness again. Not peace, not pride, just the quiet that follows survival. That moment where nothing has to be explained because everything already made itself clear. She didn't feel like a victor. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who had outlasted another test and knew more were waiting. But for now, she watched the sun begin to rise across the edge of the lot, painting the asphalt in long streaks of gold and rust. And in that light, she let her guard down just 1 inch. Not enough to be seen, but enough to breathe. Because when you fight that hard to hold the line, even a little air can feel like grace. By the time the sun had fully broken over the horizon, casting long amber streaks across the quiet parking lot, Sabrina was already inside the station, sitting behind the counter like nothing had happened, like the night hadn't tested every piece of her discipline, her judgment, and her restraint. Her hands were raw, where the baton grip had pressed too tightly, and a dull ache radiated from her left shoulder, where one of the men had landed harder than she expected, but her posture gave none of that away. She sat upright, calm, methodical, slowly reviewing the surveillance footage for the 3rd time, not because she questioned what she did, but because she wanted to make sure she hadn't missed anything. The videos confirmed what her instincts had already told her. It wasn't just a random act of revenge, it was a coordinated probe, a field test meant to learn her response time, her level of force, her threshold. The way they moved, the way they scattered after the first 2 were taken down, how one of them hung back near the truck the entire time without engaging it was all intentional, and she knew now that it hadn't ended. That night wasn't a finale. It was a beginning, a message. Or maybe a question, how far are you willing to go? She paused the footage at a still frame, her body mid-strike, the attacker's face blurred in motion, frozen in that exact instant between dominance and regret. She stared at it for a long time, the silence in the store wrapping around her like a thin blanket pulled too tight, offering no warmth, only coverage. She wasn't proud of what she saw, but she wasn't ashamed either. There was no triumph in defending yourself, only necessity, only aftermath. Later that morning, Deputy Jennings stopped by again, unannounced, walking in without her usual cautious rhythm. She didn't ask for coffee, didn't ask if Sabrina was okay. She just stood near the window and looked out at the empty lot like it might hold answers neither of them could find in a report. The silence between them was long but not uncomfortable, more like the kind of quiet that settles between people who've seen the same hard truths and run out of ways to make them softer. I watched the footage, Jennings said, finally not turning around. You kept it controlled. You didn't go too far. Sabrina nodded, once slow and deliberate. That was the plan. Jennings exhaled through her nose, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the counter. But the town's split. Some are saying you escalated. Others think you're not going far enough. I didn't come here to impress anyone, Sabrina replied. I came here to help my cousin and keep this place standing. Jennings turned to face her, then eyes tired but sharp. Well, you're doing that. But it's getting harder to ignore that someone's trying to pull you into something bigger. Sabrina didn't answer right away. She folded her arms, leaned back slightly in the chair, and watched a fly buzz lazily near the light fixture overhead. They're testing boundaries. Mine, yours, the town's Braedom, seeing how much they can stretch before something snaps. Jennings frowned. You think there'll be more? There's always more, Sabrina said almost too quietly. The question is, who shows up next and how far they're willing to go? Jennings didn't argue. She just looked at her for a few seconds longer, then reached into her jacket and slid a small plastic bag across the counter. Inside was a broken silver keychain with a jagged edge and 3 letters engraved along the side. Sabrina didn't need to look closely to recognize it. It belonged to one of the men from the first attack, the one who tried to pull her over the counter. It was military issue, not active, but real. You know what that means? Jennings asked. Sabrina picked it up carefully, turned it over in her hand, then placed it back down without a word. Her jaw clenched not in anger but in recognition. Because that keychain meant these men weren't just random drifters, they had ties, affiliations, training. Some of them may have been in uniform once. Some of them may have sat through the same briefing she had. That changed everything. Or maybe it confirmed what she already suspected: this wasn't personal. It was structured. By the afternoon, word had already begun to spread that federal agents were asking questions not because of the violence but because of the affiliations. A quiet inquiry, still unofficial, but enough to make the people of Red Mesa uneasy. And when things get uneasy in small towns, the blame floats like dust, waiting to settle on someone who doesn't blend in easily. Sabrina felt it before she heard it, those subtle shifts in energy when regulars stopped making eye contact, when folks lingered too long outside the store, but didn't come in when her phone buzzed with messages that weren't threats, but weren't friendly either. Whispers turning into stories, stories turning into suspicion. She hadn't asked for attention, but now, like it or not, she was the center of something unraveling. That night the wind was dry and restless. The gas pumps creaked in the breeze, and the flag by the road flapped harder than usual, the fabric frayed near the edges from too many summers without replacement. Sabrina walked the perimeter of the store, slow and thoughtful, flashlight in hand, scanning every shadow like a reader returning to the first page of a story she already knew the ending to. She wasn't looking for enemies. She was looking for patterns, anything familiar, anything out of place. But the strange thing was nothing looked unusual. Everything was exactly where it had always been, and that more than anything told her something was coming. She paused near the dumpster, where she'd left the crowbar from the last attack. It was gone now. Not picked up by law enforcement. Not collected for evidence. Just missing. Like someone had come back to retrieve it. She crouched, studied the gravel, saw faint boot prints too new to belong to her or Jennings or anyone with a reason to be there. Then she stood slowly, turned toward the road, and stared into the stretch of dark where the streetlight flickered and died again. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood there still, and certain, letting the quiet surround her not as comfort but as warning. Because she knew the difference now, between being watched and being studied, between surviving and being hunted, and most of all between silence as peace and silence as strategy. The morning after the trucks vanished into the desert, Sabrina found the words painted across the back of the store, thick black letters, crude and uneven, sprayed fast by someone who didn't need it to be art, just loud. It wasn't the first message she'd received, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder, the kind meant to linger long after the paint faded. We see you. No punctuation, no symbol. Just those 3 words, bleeding down the cinder block wall, like the desert had decided it could whisper now. She stared at it for a full minute before she moved one hand on her hip, the other gripping the rag she'd brought out to check the coolant lines. The breeze was light, not enough to cool the heat rising behind her ears, but enough to carry the smell of gasoline and gravel. She didn't touch the paint. Not yet. She just stood there, letting it sink in, not the words themselves, but the decision behind them. Someone had come close again, close enough to write in her shadow, and leave before she knew they were there. Inside the store was quiet, no customers yet. Just the hum of the cooler and the faint static of a radio she hadn't changed in days. She walked slowly to the back office, boot soles scuffing across linoleum, and flipped the feed from the night before. At 3:17 a.m., the motion detector had activated. The camera at the southwest corner showed a figure in a hoodie moving fast, hugging the fence-line body, low head down. 2 minutes. That's all it took. 2 minutes to leave something permanent behind. She sat down at the desk, let the footage play again, this time slower, pausing at each frame where the figure turned slightly, just enough to glimpse a chin, a jawline, the white streak of something tucked behind one ear. Not a stranger, not unfamiliar. She'd seen that movement before weeks ago, at the edge of a parking lot in a reflection in the slight dip of a shoulder before a punch. It was him, one of the early ones, the kid who hadn't fought, who had run when given the chance. The one who had hesitated, and now he was back, not with fists, with a can of paint. Sabrina exhaled and leaned back in the chair, the leather creaking beneath her weight, the ceiling fan ticking overhead with each slow rotation. This wasn't just graffiti, this was ritual, and the moment she understood that something inside her steadied, not hardened, not broken, just a line. Later that afternoon, she scrubbed the wall with solvent and sandpaper, working in slow circles. Not because the job required it, but because her mind did. She could have painted over it in 5 minutes, but that felt too easy, too dismissive. She needed to feel it come off layer by layer, needed to replace each letter with silence. People drove by, glanced over, didn't stop. One truck slowed windows, tinted too dark for the law, then rolled past with the kind of slowness that made it clear the driver wanted to be seen but not identified. She wiped sweat from her forehead and kept working. By evening, the wall was blank again, but not clean. Faint lines remained, ghosts of words that couldn't be unsaid, only worn down. Inside, she mopped the floor, reset the snack racks, turned off the monitor, and stood at the window watching the sun dip behind the low hills, its last light catching on the dusty surface of the pumps. Jennings called around 7, voice rough like she'd just come off a long shift or hadn't slept at all. "You get that message last night?" she asked. "Yeah," Sabrina said. "I cleaned it." There was a pause. "Then want to file it." Sabrina looked at her reflection in the window, saw the line of her jaw, the way her shoulders didn't lift, even when she inhaled. "Number, not yet." Another pause. Then quieter. "You sure?" "I'm not the one who's scared," Sabrina replied. Jennings didn't argue. That night she walked the perimeter again, flashlight sweeping across the dirt and the fence posts, watching for the things people leave behind when they move too quickly. Shoe prints, torn cloth, the glint of a dropped object. Nothing. Just wind and gravel and the distant buzz of power lines stretching toward the horizon. She walked slowly, not because she expected anything, but because it mattered to be thorough, to be present, to remind whoever was watching that she wasn't going anywhere. When she reached the back corner of the lot where the light didn't quite reach and the air felt colder against her neck, she stopped and stood still, letting the quiet settle over her like a second skin. The kind of quiet that carries weight. The kind that makes people confess or flee. She stayed there for a long time, eyes scanning the tree line, listening for something more honest than footsteps. But the night gave her nothing, just wind and silence. And that was enough for now. It was just past midnight when Sabrina first saw the drone, small, almost silent, hovering beyond the far end of the lot where the light from the last security flood faded into a soft curtain of shadow. At first she thought it might have been a trick of her tired eyes, a distant star drifting off course, or a bird lit briefly by passing headlights. But then it moved against the wind, tilted slightly, and held its place like a question that refused to disappear. She watched it from inside the store, standing behind the counter with her hands resting flat on the edge, eyes narrowed, breath, even trying to measure not just what she saw but what it meant. The drone didn't come close. It hovered at a distance that made identification hard but intention clear. Someone wanted to see her. Someone wanted to watch. And whoever they weren't ready to get their boots dirty just yet. This was surveillance, not confrontation, cold, detached, technical. But beneath the technology was something older, something more human, curiosity, wrapped in control power disguised as caution. She turned off the interior lights one by one, leaving only the coolers humming in the background and a dim lamp above the coffee station. Then she stepped into the shadows herself, letting her eyes adjust to the dark as she moved quietly toward the side window where the angle gave her a better view of the open sky. The drone was still there, still steady, still waiting. She didn't reach for her phone. She didn't call the sheriff. She just watched, allowing the stillness to stretch, allowing the unknown to settle around her like fog over warm ground. If they wanted her to panic, they'd miscalculated. If they wanted to shake her, well, they didn't know her history. They didn't know how many nights she had spent in places far worse than this, with danger, less subtle, and men more direct. Eventually, the drone tilted once more, rose slightly, then vanished beyond the trees to the south, disappearing the way it had come, without sound, without warning, without reason. But something about its exit didn't feel like retreat. It felt like a bookmark, a pause, like a hand lifting from a chess piece before stepping back to study the board. Sabrina sat down again, this time by the back door, where the air moved more freely and the quiet was less performative. She didn't turn the lights back on. Instead, she reached for her notebook, the one she kept for patterns, numbers, names she wasn't ready to say aloud, and jotted a short entry in clean, deliberate print. Drone, midnight, south tree line. Watched for 7 minutes. Then she underlined it once and shut the book without ceremony. The rest of the night passed in stillness, but it wasn't rest. By morning she could feel it in her spine, the shift, the escalation, the change in strategy. The men from before had used fists and threats, noise and presence. This was different. This was quiet, precise, removed. It wasn't about scaring her. It was about studying her, mapping her decisions, timing her responses, and that made it more dangerous. She spent the next few hours checking her perimeter. Every camera, every cable, every sensor. Nothing was broken, nothing moved. But something had changed. In the alley, she found a boot print she didn't recognize, wider than hers, newer than last night's wind. She crouched next to it, touched the edge of the imprint with her fingertip, and closed her eyes for a second, breathing in the dry air like it might offer a name. Later that day, while the store was quiet and the sun hung heavy in the sky, she spoke briefly with Luis over the phone. His voice was still hoarse from the injury, but his tone was clear. "You don't owe anyone anything, Sabrina," he said. "You could walk away from this. Come home. Let this place fall apart if it has to." But she only replied, "It's not the place I'm standing for." He didn't press her. He never did. She spent the rest of the day reinforcing the station. Nothing loud, nothing obvious. Just quiet adjustments made out of habit, not fear. She double-checked the auxiliary power system, added a second battery to the backup, repositioned 2 of the cameras for better angles. Then she walked the outer fence line twice, once at dusk, once after full dark flashlight, sweeping across dry soil and low brush, listening not just for movement but for intent. No one came. But she knew someone was out there. That evening, a delivery truck stopped, briefly dropped off a case of bottled water, and the driver asked her, half joking, half serious, if the rumors were true. That someone had sent people out here to test her. That she was part of something bigger now. She smiled faintly, signed the receipt, and said, "People like stories. They're easier to control than facts." When he left, she stood alone under the porch light and watched the sky again. No drone this time, just stars. But she didn't feel alone. She felt observed, measured. And as she locked the doors for the night, she didn't wonder if they would come back. She only wondered when, and whether they'd be ready for what she had become in the quiet they thought was weakness. Because silence was never her surrender, it was just her stance. It was almost midnight when Sabrina heard the first sound, light, metallic, almost like a shopping cart, scraping against pavement, but slower, more deliberate, like it was being dragged just out of sight. She paused in the middle of restocking the freezer aisle, fingers still wrapped around a 6-pack of orange soda, her breath suspended, ears tuning into the night the way a soldier does in unfamiliar terrain. For a moment, she didn't move, just let her senses reach farther than the walls, beyond the hum of refrigeration, past the dusty front glass and into the blackness where lights ended and the unknown began. The sound came again, closer, this time followed by the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, steady and wide. The kind of steps made by someone who wasn't in a hurry but also wasn't wandering. She didn't panic. She didn't speak. She moved to the counter, set down the sodas gently, then reached beneath the register and switched the feed from the rotating display to a fixed 4-panel view: front lot, back alley, pump station, and rear gate. Nothing yet. Just shadow and wind. She scanned the edges, eyes trained to look for movement that wasn't obvious: shoulders before, faces, reflections in glass before the body appears. Then, from the northwest corner of the screen, a tall figure stepped into view. White hoodie, gray pants, hood up. No bag, no weapon in hand, just that unmistakable posture of someone who'd made up their mind about something. He walked up to the front door and stopped, not knocking, not testing the handle, just standing there, watching. Sabrina stayed where she was, leaning against the counter, her heartbeat steady but sharp. She studied his face through the camera, young early 20s, skin pale and the infrared expression unreadable. It wasn't one of the 6 from before, not the driver, not the runner, someone new, or someone just now stepping out from the background. The figure raised his hand slowly, not in greeting, not to wave, just to press his palm against the glass like he was testing its thickness, maybe its truth. Sabrina didn't move, didn't flinch. She waited. After nearly a full minute, he stepped back, turned, and walked along the front of the building to the side alley out of sight. A second later, the motion detector behind the store clicked on. A shadow passed beneath it. Then silence. She moved quietly, exiting the front without turning on more lights, making her way toward the side door where the fire escape lamp cast a dull cone of yellow across the wall. The handle was cold in her hand. She opened it slowly, stepped outside. No sound, no figure. But there, painted across the bottom of the back wall, hurried and uneven in blue spray, was a phrase she hadn't seen before. "This won't stop us." No signature, no mark, just that sentence like a statement of fact rather than a threat. Sabrina stared at it, her jaw clenched, her breath calm but deep. Whoever wrote it didn't come for confrontation. They came for reminder, for provocation, for something slower than violence but heavier than fear. She looked down at the gravel and saw it, one footprint sharp and recent pointing back toward the road. She crouched, slowly ran her fingers along the edge of the paint, still tacky, still fresh. It had been written no more than 10 minutes ago. Her eyes scanned the darkness beyond the lot where the road bent west into nowhere. No car sounds, no headlights, just the desert breathing. She stood again and whispered, "I see you too," though no one was there to hear it. Inside, she grabbed a rag and solvent but didn't scrub the words right away. Instead, she sat in the chair by the loading dock and let her body sink into the stillness, not in defeat, not in fatigue, but in awareness. This wasn't just someone acting out. This was escalation, not in numbers, but in language. Not fists, not fire. Words placed where they knew she would find them. A message not of what they would do, but that they could. The next morning, she left the phrase on the wall, let it dry beneath the rising sun, let it be seen by passing eyes, and whispered over breakfast at the diner. Jennings came by just before noon. Said nothing at first, just walked to the back with her, looked at the paint and exhaled. "They want you to react," she said finally. Sabrina nodded. "I know. You gonna report it?" "Already did." Jennings stared at the writing, then glanced at Sabrina. "Why not take it down?" "Because people need to see it." Jennings looked again. The words weren't loud, weren't dripping with hate, but they were real, and that made them dangerous. "You think they'll stop?" Sabrina shrugged. "Number. But I think they're watching for a weakness." Jennings didn't respond. She just stood there a moment longer, then walked back to her cruiser and drove off without another word. That evening, Sabrina finally scrubbed the wall clean. The paint peeled in layers, the blue bleeding into the rag like it had something left to say. When it was gone, she stepped back, took a deep breath, and stood for a moment longer in front of the blank wall, her eyes steady, her shoulders square. The light flickered once above her head, then stayed on. It began again in the stillness, not with noise, not with sirens or fists, but with motion just beyond the edge of visibility. A glint off metal, the shuffle of footsteps in places that should have been quiet, the unmistakable presence of an intention in the air. Sabrina felt it before she saw it, the same way animals sense the shift in wind before a storm breaks. The store had been empty for almost an hour, just her and the hum of the lights, the quiet buzz of the cooler compressors, and the dry rustle of desert wind tapping at the back door like a thought trying to be let in. She was at the register, tallying the last receipts, moving slow, not out of exhaustion, but because she knew better than to rush when things turned silent. The monitors flickered once, a brief static pulse across the corner of the screen where the southeast camera fed its signal, and then just for a second went black. Not all four, just one. Enough to mean something. Enough to tighten the muscles at the base of her neck and slow her breath to a deliberate pace. She stood slowly, keeping her hand on the edge of the counter, letting her body adjust before her thoughts did. She tapped the camera feed button again. It reset. Static. No picture. No sound. She didn't panic. She walked calmly to the side window, took in the lot, the pumps, the field beyond them, the stretch of dark highway that bent out toward the hills. And there, at the edge of the fence line, just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure, alone, still, watching. He didn't move when she stepped forward. He didn't approach. He just stood there, like he'd been planted into the dirt waiting for something to bloom. White hoodie, hands in pockets, body perfectly still. She knew better than to assume he was alone. People like him, people who moved in shadows and left messages on walls, didn't come without reason. They came to measure something. Sabrina turned off the front lights without a word, slipped into the back, grabbed the baton from the drawer near the mop bucket, and unlocked the rear exit without a sound. Her steps outside were silent, careful, each boot pressing into the gravel with the weight of someone who knew terrain better than she knew sleep. The wind had picked up again, carrying dust and tension. Somewhere off in the distance, a coyote howled once and then went quiet. She circled behind the dumpster, keeping low, staying out of the arcs of the cameras she'd positioned herself. That's when she heard a second pair of feet behind the propane tank stack, heavier than the first, moving low, slow, like they expected her to be somewhere else. She waited. Let them step closer. Let them believe they still held the element of surprise. When the figure passed the corner, she stepped out and swept his legs clean from under him, catching his shirt collar before he hit the ground, to soften the impact without sacrificing the message. "Don't move," she said, and he didn't. She turned him slightly, looked into his face, young, no more than 20, cheeks flushed with either adrenaline or fear. His eyes were wide, his breath fast. But he wasn't armed. Just a phone in one hand and a folded piece of paper in the other. "What's this?" she asked, taking it from his fingers. He didn't answer. She read the words in the dim glow of the overhead light. "You're not the only one trained. No signature, no date. Just handwriting sharp, slanted, clean." She looked down at him again. "You come alone." He nodded, hesitant. "He just wanted you to know." "Who's he?" But the kid only shook his head. "I don't ask questions." She let him up slowly, took the phone from his other hand, powered it off without looking at the screen, and tossed it into the trash behind her. Then she turned him toward the gate and walked him off the property, not violently, not even angrily, just firmly. When he was gone, when the fence had closed behind him and the road swallowed his shape, she walked back to the wall and read the message again. Not a threat, not quite. A statement of fact. Sabrina folded the paper neatly, walked inside, and slipped it into the drawer beneath the counter beside the older notes. License plates, time stamps, faces she hadn't yet placed. She closed the drawer and leaned against the counter, eyes on the door, ears on the hum of the building. This wasn't over. She'd known that since the first night. But now it was changing, becoming smarter, more deliberate. She spent the next 2 hours reviewing footage, front-back alley pump view. 2 of the men had come in earlier that day, bought gum and soda, stood too close to the shelves, spent too long near the coolers. No words, just presence. The kind that left behind scent and memory and doubt. The kind meant to test the edges of space before entering fully. By dawn, she was still awake. She stood outside the store as the sky went from black to gray, to that faint, haunting blue that always came before full sunrise. The air was cold now, not from the wind but from something else. Expectation, maybe. Or realization. She looked out over the road at the power lines stretching into the distance at the truck stop sign 2 miles away, blinking red and gold in the morning haze. She thought about how far someone would go to prove a point, how long they'd wait, how precise they'd be when they believed they had nothing left to lose. Then she closed her eyes for a moment, felt the chills settle into her chest, and took the deepest breath she'd allowed herself in days. When she opened her eyes again, the world was quiet. And so was she. By the time the trucks rolled in, the wind had shifted again, harder this time, rough against the metal siding, carrying a bite that didn't belong to the desert's usual rhythm. Sabrina had been standing behind the counter, watching the last of the sunlight bleed off the horizon through the dusty front windows, her arms folded loosely across her chest, the corners of her eyes tight with fatigue that hadn't fully settled into her bones yet. She hadn't touched her coffee in over an hour, and the station had been still for longer than usual, the kind of quiet that didn't feel earned but borrowed. And as soon as she heard the tires crunch against the edge of the lot, she knew tonight wasn't going to end with silence. 2 trucks. Older models. Covered in dust thick enough to conceal plate numbers and intentions, headlights off, engines idling low like they had all the time in the world. She didn't move immediately. She waited, listening to the subtle rhythm of boots, dropping to gravel doors, closing soft voices, low but clear enough to carry purpose. She recognized it, the cadence of control, the slow choreography of men who didn't want to be loud but who needed to be seen. 6 of them, maybe 7. One stood out taller than the rest, moving like someone used to giving orders, but not because of a badge, because of habit. Sabrina exhaled, slowly feeling the baton where it leaned beside the register, her fingers brushing it like a reminder she didn't need. She had fought before harder than this, darker than this. But something about this night felt more pointed, less about intimidation, more about closing a chapter that someone else had started writing for her. She scanned the cameras. They weren't spreading like last time. They were grouping tight formation near the pumps, talking in short bursts, nodding toward the storefront with glances instead of gestures. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This was the beginning of a message. She stepped out from behind the counter and moved through the store with deliberate slowness, turning off all but one row of ceiling lights, leaving enough glow to outline her silhouette behind the glass. She knew how to look still without looking vulnerable, how to stand tall without standing hostile. She opened the front door before they could knock, stepped outside just far enough for the motion sensor to trigger, casting a broad, white halo across the lot. And then she waited. The man in front, the tall one, took a slow step forward. His hands weren't in his pockets, but they weren't open either. His eyes were fixed on hers, sharp, unreadable, the way men look when they want to make you flinch without lifting a finger. "You've made this complicated," he said, voice steady, almost polite. "Could have just closed up and walked away." Sabrina didn't answer. She didn't shift her weight. She just let the words hang there dry as the wind cutting through the pump hoses behind them. The man continued, "We're not interested in blood. We just want this place quiet again. Forgotten." She raised an eyebrow. "It's quiet now." He smiled, small and humorless. "You know what I mean." Another step forward. 2 more figures behind him moved slightly to the side, not quite flanking but not hiding either. The way you see in practice formations before a takedown. She measured the distance, 12 feet to the first one, 5 feet behind him to the next 2, 6 more to the trucks. Not enough space to escape, but enough to control. "You think this is still your town," she said, voice low even. "You think fear works the way it used to." "It still works fine," he replied. "You're just harder to scare than most." She almost smiled. Not out of pride, but recognition. The moment cracked when one of the men in the rear moved too fast, reaching for something under his coat. Maybe impatience, maybe a mistake, maybe both. Sabrina moved first. The baton extended in a flash, her body rotating into the strike before thought had a chance to catch up. The man stumbled back off balance, weapon falling from his hand with a dull clang as metal hit concrete. Everything exploded into motion. The second came forward, swinging wild. She ducked, pivoted, swept his legs clean from under him, brought the baton down hard across his shoulder as he hit the ground. Screams now. Footsteps. The man in front lunged faster, trained, but so was she. She sidestepped, redirected his momentum with a twist of his arm, sent him crashing into the side of the truck, hard enough to leave a dent. But it wasn't about violence. It was about message. And hers was clearer. When the dust settled, 3 men were on the ground, groaning, 2 more backing away, eyes wide, breath ragged, and the last one, the leader, sitting against the tire lip, bloodied hands spread in disbelief. "You don't get it," he muttered, spitting into the dirt. "You can't hold this place." Sabrina leaned forward just enough for him to see her eyes fully. "I don't need to hold it. I just need you to stop thinking you do." For a moment there was nothing but the hum of the generator and the slow grinding of one truck engine still running, as if it hadn't realized the plan had fallen apart. Then they stood, one by one, bruised, humbled, but not broken, at least not in the way Sabrina had hoped. They climbed back into their trucks like men waking from a dream they thought they controlled. She watched them leave, didn't chase, didn't yell. Just stood under the light as their tail lights faded, red glowing dimmer and dimmer until the night returned to stillness. Inside, she washed the blood from her knuckles in the back sink, staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror above it. Not to study her injuries, but to see if something in her had shifted. She didn't look angry. She didn't look tired. She looked certain, and that more than anything felt like victory. It wasn't the bruises that stayed with her. Not the torn shoulder muscle or the sharp sting along her ribs when she lifted something too quickly, or even the slight tremor in her wrist from the last baton strike that had landed too close to bone. Those things would heal in time, or at least settle into a dull ache that her body would learn to carry. What lingered was something quieter, something more complicated, a kind of awareness that settled deep beneath her skin like a pulse she could feel without touching. A recognition that she had crossed a line, not in action, but in perception, that those men hadn't just come to scare her anymore. They had come to end something they didn't fully understand. For the first time since she'd taken over the gas station from Luis, Sabrina took a day to close the store. Not because she was hurt, not because she was afraid, but because she needed the space to breathe in silence without being watched. The sign on the door read, "Closed for maintenance," though there was nothing wrong with the shelves, the register, or the pumps. The maintenance she needed wasn't mechanical, it was mental. She spent the morning sitting outside on a folding chair beneath the faded awning, staring out at the cracked parking lot, drinking cold coffee from a metal thermos, listening to the low hum of power lines that stretched toward the hills like telephone wires strung between old truths and the ones nobody wanted to say out loud. The wind was dry and persistent, pushing dust in slow spirals that danced across the ground before fading into nothing. Occasionally, a truck would pass on the main road, slowing slightly when the driver saw the sign lingering long enough to wonder what had happened before, disappearing in a cloud of grit. She didn't wave, she didn't nod. She just watched, eyes calm, hands still, body at rest, but never entirely relaxed. Her shoulders remained squared like someone sitting at attention in an empty field, waiting for the next move that might never come. At some point around noon, Deputy Jennings pulled up not in her cruiser but in her personal truck jeans and a flannel shirt, instead of her uniform hair tied back loosely, like she hadn't decided whether this was an official visit or just a stop for conversation. She got out slow, moved like she was approaching a friend's porch rather than a scene. No clipboard, no radio. Just a look that said she'd seen the footage too, and didn't know whether to ask what came next or sit down and wait for Sabrina to tell her. "You all right?" Jennings asked, voice steady, not soft. Sabrina looked at her over the rim of the thermos. "Define all right." Jennings cracked a small, tired smile and leaned against the post beside her. "You want backup next time." "There shouldn't have to be a next time," Sabrina replied, but they both knew that wasn't how things worked anymore. They sat in silence for a while after that, two women separated by job titles and decades of different war stories, but tied together now by something more immediate: reality. The weight of having to hold the line when no one else was willing to name the shape of the threat. Jennings eventually cleared her throat and nodded toward the now clean wall where the last spray-painted message had been. "You think they're done?" "No," Sabrina said. "I think they're rethinking." Jennings nodded again. "That's the part that worries me." She didn't stay long. Said she had reports to file, phone calls to dodge, rumors to chase down before they grew teeth. When she left, Sabrina watched the dust trail rise behind her tires and disappear into the shimmer of heat near the edge of the pavement. Then she stood up, stretched slowly, and walked to the side of the building where the new camera had been mounted the day before. She adjusted the angle just slightly, pointed it not at the pump station or the alley where they usually came from, but toward the open road, toward the space beyond the edge of the feed, the place where most people forget they're still being seen. That night she slept behind the counter instead of in the back office, wrapped in a thick canvas blanket, one arm draped over her ribs, the other resting near the silent alarm switch. Not because she thought someone would come, but because her body hadn't yet decided how to trust a quiet night again. Outside, the wind shifted directions for the first time in days, and with it came the smell of creosote and dry wood and something else, something heavier like rain that hadn't fallen yet. She lay there for a long time, eyes closed, but not asleep, listening to the slow creak of the building as it cooled, the occasional groan of metal under pressure, the distant bark of a dog far beyond the tree line, and beneath it all the hum of something else, a pressure building slowly, not in sound but in certainty. Not everything that came for you knocked first. Some things just waited. And watching was its own form of invasion. By dawn she had made her decision. Not out of impulse, not from fear, but from something else, resolve sharpened by repetition, strengthened by clarity. She would stop waiting. She would no longer respond. From this point forward she would dictate. She stood outside as the sun cracked across the eastern ridge, letting the light hit her face without blinking, without moving, without folding into herself, like someone trying to avoid being seen. She wanted to be seen. She needed to be. Because there was a difference between being targeted and being chosen. And after everything they'd done, everything they'd tried to push into her space, her silence, her body, they still hadn't understood one thing. She hadn't come here to protect the store. She had come to protect the line. And the line, whether they knew it or not, had already been drawn. Right here, under this sky, on this dirt, by her. There was a kind of peace that came in the aftermath. Not the easy kind, not relief, but something steadier, more grounded, like standing barefoot in cold sand at dawn and feeling the weight of the world without the need to fight it. After everything, the fights, the warnings, the messages scrawled in spray paint or delivered through trembling hands, Sabrina didn't feel victorious or vindicated or even angry. She just felt still. And in that stillness there was power. Not the kind you shout about or hang medals on, but the kind you carry deep in your chest like a steady heartbeat that doesn't ask for permission to keep going. She'd left the store open that day. No sign on the door, no cameras re-angled. Just the windows washed clean, and the counters wiped down, the shelves restocked like nothing had happened. Not because she was pretending, and not because she had something to prove, but because normalcy, when it was chosen, not forced, could be its own kind of defiance. She brewed a fresh pot of coffee around 6:30, just as the first streaks of orange cracked the horizon, and leaned against the doorframe, with her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug that Luis had left behind years ago. The first customer was a trucker. Quiet, polite eyes scanning the corners of the store like he'd read the stories and wasn't sure which version to believe. He paid cash, didn't ask any questions. Just said, "Be safe out here," before walking back out into the sun shoulders, a little tighter than when he came in. Sabrina just nodded, no smile, no explanation, letting the silence speak what needed to be said. Because sometimes the most honest answers come without words. Around mid-morning, she stepped out into the parking lot to sweep the dust from the corners where it always gathered, no matter how often she tried to push it away. She watched a hawk circling high above the hills, its shadow moving across the gravel like a slow memory. A neighbor passed by in an old sedan, honked, once raised 2 fingers off the steering wheel, half salute, half prayer, and she returned it with a glance. People weren't avoiding her anymore, but they weren't rushing toward her either. They didn't know what to do with someone who'd stood their ground and stayed standing. The phone rang just after noon. It was Jennings. "I heard they're backing off," she said. "For now," Sabrina replied. "You believe that?" "No," she answered. "But I believe they're watching me watch them." Jennings didn't argue. "You need anything?" "Yeah," Sabrina said after a pause. "I need time, and I need them to understand what time means to me." Jennings let that hang for a moment, then said, "Call me if something changes." "Something always does," Sabrina replied. That afternoon, a young woman came into the store, couldn't have been more than 19, maybe 20. She bought a bottle of water and a granola bar, but lingered at the counter, eyes, uncertain fingers tapping against the worn surface, like she was waiting for the courage to catch up with whatever had brought her in. "Are you the woman from the video?" she asked. Sabrina didn't answer immediately. She looked at the girl's hands, at the way they trembled just slightly, not from fear but something closer to hope. "I'm the woman who was here," she finally said. The girl nodded like that was the answer she needed. "Thank you," she whispered, and left without saying anything else. And in that quiet, something shifted, not in Sabrina but in the air around her, like recognition had replaced fear in one small corner of a very wide, uncertain world. As the sun lowered again, casting golden light across the empty lot, Sabrina walked to the edge of the property line, stood with her boots planted in the dirt, and watched the horizon. There were no trucks today. No shadows creeping along the fence, no figures testing her defenses or drawing lines where they didn't belong. Just the sound of birds settling into evening and the wind brushing against her collar like an old friend who didn't ask questions. She closed her eyes for a moment, let the weight of everything press gently into her spine, not crushing, not dragging, just there. The truth of what had been. The certainty of what wouldn't be again. And when she opened them, she felt it. Not victory, not safety. Just ownership. Of her breath, of her space, of her silence. There are battles in life that don't involve gunfire and no crowds, watching just you, the silence and the decision to stand your ground or walk away. Sabrina's story isn't just about bravery in the face of danger. It's a deeper lesson about the power of calm and the strength that comes from not letting others define your worth or your limits. For those who've lived through decades of change, loss, and resilience, that message rings even truer. You don't have to shout to be heard, and you don't need fists to defend what's right. You only need to be steady, know who you are, and refuse to back down when life gets unreasonable. Sometimes life tests us not to break us, but to remind us that every scar, every time we rise again, is a quiet declaration. We're still here unshaken and not easily broken. If this story made you reflect, if you saw a piece of yourself in that quiet strength, take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Every follower helps us keep telling real, heartfelt stories like this, made for those who truly understand the value of standing tall in silence. Thank you for listening.